I want to introduce you to a research experience in Austria at Innsbruck University, where I have always been struggling, in a way, to build this bridge from what is written in those books and what goes on in the minds of those students. And there is all this knowledge, and Kari was telling us we have to build a bridge across there, which I think is quite a challenging thing. And I want to invite you how we've been trying to do that by trying to get closer to what learning as an experience is. In other words, what's beyond the reach of teaching. And Kari was pointing out we don't know what's going on. That's why we have to react spontaneously. And when we look at the big picture, we have school effectiveness, we had PISA studies, etc., where we get lots of results on learning, but nothing about learning as such. And then we have the movement of school improvement, which tries to answer the questions, how do we get there? But we have very little information and research data on how we actually get there. Then John Hattie, who's discussed almost globally, he says, why can't they change after all his meta-studies he looked at? And he meant teachers, policymakers, teacher educators, and oftentimes parents. And he argues this requires an openness and a willingness to seek a better alternative to what the teacher is currently doing. Adopting any innovations means discontinuing the use of familiar learning. Now, Biester speaks of a pedagogy of interruption, so you have to sort of interrupt and start thinking, but thinking as such is not enough if you don't really take initiative to research more to what Hattie is arguing. If the teacher's lens can be changed to seeing learning through the eyes of students, this would be an excellent beginning, he says, after all the empirical study he has provided. But of course it's impossible to look through the student's eyes, because there are only the student's eyes, and there are the teacher's eyes and the heart and everything. And this is more or less where our venture started at Innsbruck University. The first thing I had to do, we have the word Unterricht, instruction would be the American translation, which is always the perspective of a teacher. The teacher instructs. In English you have teaching and learning, which we don't have in the German language. So I had to invent a new word in German, which is called Lernseits von Unterricht. So I'll explain to you in a minute. It's difficult to explain. I tried to do it by being mindful of learning. And being mindful of learning would, if I use a metaphor, be like a coin, a euro, where you have two sides, and teaching and learning are like two sides of a coin. Because if I show you one side, if the one is on, you would never know what's behind it. You have to turn it round. So it's the same for a teacher. If he or she has the preparation, he knows all about the one, but he or she has to turn around and find out in class what's actually there at the other end of teaching, beyond teaching, so to speak. And this is why we came up with the question, the research question in a way, how can we discover and explore the essence of learning experiences beyond the reach of teaching? Learning is not visible. Neuroscientists try to do it with making things visible in the brain, but that's not learning, that's chemistry going on. It's the human being that learns and not the brain. So we can't really see learning. But what we can do is to look or find out about how students experience learning. And the context of the research was that we had a research team of 12 PhD students and one postdoc. In German, we have the habilitation, which is a postdoc entry into scientific community. So it's a higher level. And we had 24 sites of Austrian reform schools, because in German-speaking countries we still have the gymnasium and the traditional school. And there's always been attempts to go comprehensive. And this is another attempt by our present minister. And we have used those changes in the reform where they did away with streaming into different groups of students. So teachers were suddenly confronted with a very diversity of students in the classroom. And in each classroom, we just tried to look at 2 students' experience in the first year of this new school, which had just been introduced or founded. Yeah? It could actually have been 1 student, but with my doctoral students, I thought if they just try to find out about 1 student, they think this is the one and only. So they always have a comparative view. And secondly, they had to do 2 schools so that they didn't think this is what a school, learning in a school is like. So they always had this comparative aspect because people are not only different, they are different in a different way. And this is what we have been trying to work out in this research. When we think of the research questions which you have to put, we were trying to ask what is the nature or essence of experience of learning in the schools of our research sites? What does it mean to learn there? What are these experiences like? What is that makes learning at these schools learning at these schools? What's the phenomenon in its whatness, which goes back to Van Manen we talked about. What's the whatness of learning? Then how can we sensitively and tactfully study the lived experiences of 10-year-olds in their first year at lower secondary schools across Austria? We did it across Austria, though, just as not to have, well, we had the big picture from Kari there. How can our findings enlighten pedagogical practice, instruction, development, pedagogical relation, policy making, etc.? So since all of these doctoral students are practitioners, and this is very ambitious nowadays to have practitioners who have a full-time job in a classroom or in a ministry or in a local education authority, to really spend the time in a research community. And so we wanted, since these people were not going to go into research afterwards, but some of them were school inspectors, and I want them, through research, to look at their job, their profession differently, and the same in the ministry, etc. And when you talk of experience, it's very difficult to find a research methodology, so we went back to Husserl, to phenomenology, because Husserl said we have to go to the things themselves, zu den Sachen selbst. Yeah? What is the essence of what we experience? And experience is the only thing we have. So we were trying to research the life world as it appears in everyday human experience by exploring the phenomena of human experience, why, as I said, had to choose a phenomenological approach. And what is special about phenomenology? Husserl would say with his students for a whole seminar, what is the essence of this? Yeah? If you say this is a glass, this is what you have been told to, but this is not what the essence is. Yeah? And the same we experienced in the classroom, and he calls that epoche, meaning you have to bracket in what you know, try to be like a tabula rasa, and bracket all the judgments, previous experience, interpretation, prior knowledge, and prejudice. Because what these doctoral students did at the beginning, since they are in the teaching profession, they always argued didactically. So that prevented them from looking from the student's perspective, yeah? Because of Unterricht takes the position of the teacher. So that was a very helpful experience. Try to do away with everything you have learned. Yeah? A colleague in Germany calls it's the competence of being incompetent again, because that makes you open for looking at this from this perspective. And also, which is important in phenomenology, is to focus on the corporeality as the foundation of human existence and perception, which is very often left out in research, especially in empirical research. So which instruments did we apply? So we had protocols of lived experience, which goes back to Van Manen. He did a lot of research in that. And then we came up with a text type, which we call vignettes, which I'm telling you about in a minute. and we were having conversation with the students, teachers, guardians, and principals, guided focus group discussions with 5 students of each class, a document analysis by the teachers and students in the study. Then we had photo data of students in the study, photos the students did concerning their learning, and explicating the essence of vignettes in readings. This is what we did afterwards with the vignettes. The whole process went through 3 years, which was a grant-subsisted project. This was the beginning year, and we finished that in 2012. Now, what is a vignette? As I said, we were inspired by Van Manen's anecdotes of lived experience, but he based those on recall, but we had co-experience. We were co-experience what was going on. A very dense narrative of poignant experiential moment, a form of literary non-fiction, a resonator of learning, and an in-between on a continuum from raw data to data analysis, which we then refer to as the process of reading. I'm just giving you a different metaphor of a vignette. This is from a painting by a historical painter. It's the fight on Louisbourg in Nova Scotia in 1758. And what the painter does there tries to give you the experience as if you had been there at that time of the history. And we use this same idea. If you read a vignette, you should more or less experience as much as possible as what the researcher experienced in the classroom. In crafting the vignettes, the researchers had to co-experience the lived experience of the students, and that was very interesting. They suddenly were struck by something the teacher said in a similar way as the students did. Yeah? Then they had to keep open, attending to the pathic elements going on, to note details in protocols of lived experience. They had to attempt to recreate rather than reconstruct the experience in a narrative form and apply a recursive writing process. And what was important, to have a kind of intersubjectivity by asking other researchers to confront them. Is that your interpretation, or is that actually what you had experienced? So that was like working with the glass, what Husserl was doing. And I want to finish with a vignette because there is not much time to deal with it in more detail. I don't know whether you can read it from behind, so I'll read it out so that everybody gets that. The 5th period, nearly the end of the school day, begins with sustained silent reading. Everyone seems to know what they are supposed to do. Without much further ado, Roland, sitting alone in the last row at the back of the classroom, turns around and stretches to take a Mickey Mouse comic book from the shelf behind him. He does not need to get up at all, his desk so close to the wall at the back. He places the comic on his lap, closes it on it, rests his head on his right elbow on the bench, and is soon lost in his reading. Again and again he chuckles out loud. Once he exclaims, "Super!" Occasionally he turns the pages back and forth. In the meantime, Mrs. Redl, the teacher, takes care of organizational matters with some of the students. After a quarter of an hour, her voice, loud enough for everyone to hear, penetrates the working noise in the room. "Close your books, put them aside, and open your notebooks," she demands. Roland is still immersed in his reading and seems not to hear anything. Everyone is following her instructions, but not Roland. The teacher approaches him and asks if he has heard what she said. Without hesitation, he reports sullenly, "Close your books, put them aside, and open your notebooks." He makes a face as he closes his comics books. So this is more or less the data we get from the field. And now we have several ways we can do that. One would be dealing with this as a researcher by reading it from a certain perspective. And you can have your own theory behind it and look at it and find out what's in it. Yeah? But we also, since we have been involved in change processes in a school system, we use them in in-service training. Yeah? So teachers would use those vignettes to get an idea and a notion of why
would the student experience this classroom situation in this way and not another way? A teacher, him or herself, is never possible and is never able to experience what's written in there, because it's the other perspective, you know, like the coin. You're always on one side, and we tried to throw some light on the back of teaching, beyond the reach of teaching. Thank you.